Welcome into the Lions247 Podcast. Happy to have you back with us. I'm Tyler Donahue, and we've got a game to look toward. Game number 11 on Penn State's 2024 schedule. Takes them on the road again one more time in the regular season. They'll face 6-4 Minnesota, 3:30 Eastern time kickoff up in Minneapolis. The number 4 Penn State Nittany Lions trying to take one more step toward that long-awaited college football playoff appearance. They are 10-6 all-time against Minnesota within this series. 4-4 record in Minneapolis overall, and losses in 1999 and 2019 derailed promising seasons, or at least what was thought possible during those seasons, a couple unbeaten runs. So there's a little bit of history here within this series. And of course, we don't have to look too far in the rearview mirror to remember the last trip that Penn State took up to Minneapolis and what occurred in that situation. So they're looking to avoid that stumble. They're hoping for some stumbles across the Big Ten, maybe to get them in position to reach Indianapolis for the conference championship game in early December, but that's still more of a tricky process. We'll talk about that, but we're going to look into this matchup. We're going to talk about what we witnessed on the practice field Wednesday, what we heard from James Franklin afterwards, and break down the most important facets of Penn State versus Minnesota with Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan from Lions247.com. Guys, happy to have you back on board. And Mark, I know I kind of tapped into your history earlier this week when we were setting the stage for Penn State versus Minnesota week. But now that we're here, there are a couple ghosts in this series for Penn State. They're 4-4 on the road against Minneapolis. And I just want to encourage everyone that thinks this is just a simple stepping stone towards the playoffs. This has been eyed as a complicated trip and a very notable hurdle for Penn State. I think really for us going back to preseason, and that became more apparent when Minnesota got hot midseason.
Yeah, speaking of history, how many weeks in the season are we? 14 or whatever it is with the buys. I finally figured out how to turn off the alerts to my texts. So everybody will be happy that if something happens, my text will not be blowing up. But yeah, I mean, this has never been an easy place other than the first time they were there. Back with Goon's team in 1994, it was 56 or 58-3. They absolutely blew them out. But the thing is, this is always a well-coached team. You know, whether or not you like PJ Fleck, I mean, he's a good coach. Comes from your tree, Tyler, at Rutgers, and they always have
from my coaching tree.
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah, and they always have enough good players to make things interesting. And, the thing that they're doing this year that I really like is this is not the most talented team. Can't run the ball. We saw what they did against your beloved Scarlet Knights with 35 yards on the ground. But they're finding a way to win outside of that game by forcing turnovers. And that's a great kind of equalizer. So for Penn State, one way of looking at this is you just can't beat yourself. And so many times when Penn State has gone out there, starting with the last trip when they had 3 key turnovers in that game, you cannot beat yourself in this game, because if you don't turn the ball over, Minnesota is not going to be able to score enough points to win. So the key for Penn State, I might be getting ahead of myself, is take care of that football. That's easier said than done, though, because as we've seen, these turnovers, kind of like at Penn State, that they're catchy. Like you can go cold and not have them for a while, or you could be like Minnesota's been for most of the season and be hot with it. So they just have to be really smart with the football. Don't take these crazy trick plays. You don't need them. Take care of the football, go straight at them, and count on your defense to do a good job. And I think they will.
We broke down Minnesota with Ryan Burns of the 247 Sports Network on our last episode that dropped on Wednesday. Hopefully you caught that. It went live on Wednesday morning.
He's great.
Really good conversation. Yeah, Ryan's absolutely a fantastic covering that team. He has been for a long time. We've caught up with him before the last couple of Minnesota matchups, including that 2019 trip. He always gives us a really clear-eyed kind of painting of where that program is in his perspective. And I think we come out of this one, and we'll get to our predictions a little bit later. But if you heard our episode, he picked Penn State to win by 2 scores. It's an 11.5-point spread. And before we break down the ins and outs of this matchup and where Penn State could potentially get tripped up and where we see some significant advantages for them against Minnesota, let's lay out the path a little bit, Daniel, in terms of what's down the line. This is kind of the antithesis of the 1-0 mentality, but you've got Minnesota this Saturday. Maryland comes to town next Saturday to Beaver Stadium, another mid-afternoon kickoff. They're 4-6 on the season. Your beloved Terps. I guess I got to throw that in there now. So it looks like Penn State's in excellent position by the outside looking in to get to that 11-1 mark. But that still doesn't guarantee them a spot in the Big Ten championship game. But it looks like it would give them a home game at Beaver Stadium for the playoffs. So in your best kind of, as far as you understand it at this stage, can you give our listeners kind of the summary of what's at stake for Penn State? What's kind of hanging in the air as it heads on the road to Minnesota?
Yeah, after last week, I forgot to give you the public congrats for winning the Lions247 Alumni Bowl with your Scarlet Knights taking on the Terps in College Park last week. But no, I think you look at these last two games and finishing at 11-1, like the door is open for Penn State to make the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis. Since the last time we all talked, Oregon clinched their spot in Indianapolis on a Tuesday afternoon instead of a Saturday, which I guess we're all getting used to this 18-team conference in a lot of different ways. But so Oregon is locked in, and then Penn State, Indiana, and Ohio State are all alive to be that other team there. I think if you're Penn State, what you want is, I believe it is Ohio State to beat Indiana and then Michigan to beat Ohio State. I believe that is the most straightforward of the two scenarios that can get them in. Otherwise, you're going down to like fourth tiebreaker type stuff, which no one really wants to get into. So if you're Penn State, I mean, you need to keep winning because you want to get into the college football playoff. You want to get a home game at Beaver Stadium on December 20th or December 21st. But then you also want the chance to play in Indianapolis on December 7th and have the chance to win the Big Ten. And if you win the Big Ten, you're locked into a top 4 seed most likely, and you get a bye week. And then your first game is a quarterfinal at a bowl site. And I think those first round buys are really, really big. I think that all of this stuff about trying to, actually it's better to be the 5 seed, or actually it's better to be the 6 seed. I think that loses water when you think about the idea of you're in a single elimination tournament. Do you want to play 3 games or 4 games to win it all? I think the answer there is 3. I know that, okay, if you play in the Big Ten tournament or Big Ten championship game, it's another game. You can get injured. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in that first round matchup against the 12 seed too. So I think that there's a lot of people feeling things out, but I think that if you're a football team, if you're a football coach, if you're a football fan, you want your team to win as many games as possible. And that would include, winning a 12th game in Indianapolis. And then that, clears your path up a little bit more, or makes it a little bit clearer, in the college football playoff. So it's been interesting to follow all those conversations. I know everyone gets a little wrapped up in the Big Ten versus SEC debate with James Franklin playing a little peacemaker, diplomat on Wednesday night. But I think that, to me, that one of the more interesting conversations, and probably the one I feel stronger about, is where you want to be seated. What is the value of those top 4 seeds? What is the value of being a conference champion in this day and age? I know that it's something that people would bring up, but I do think the committee, if you're a loser of one of those conference championship games out of the Big Ten or SEC, I don't think you'll get punished that much. I'll just add that addendum on.
I think James Franklin's commentary was really like, hey, we don't need to be going at each other, SEC, Big Ten coaches, saying this team doesn't deserve, no, why don't we just take as many spots as we can, because we're the strongest in the country, and let everyone else argue about what's left at the end. That was kind of more of how he said the SEC and Big Ten should view each other and themselves in the college football playoff. And I know a lot of people agree with that sentiment. Because I did spend some time this morning and I had some questions about it, and I reached out to you guys, reached out to a few other people. At one point, I reached out to Twitter, trying to figure out these Big Ten tiebreakers. I will just share what I learned. Either way, if you're an Indy Lions fan and you want this team to be in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship game, first time since 2016, you are rooting for the Michigan Wolverines next weekend. You want Ohio State to lose next weekend. If Indiana were to lose to Ohio State, then beat Purdue next week, and Ohio State loses to Michigan next weekend, then you would be in a situation where it's Indiana's cumulative conference winning percentage from all their opponents versus Penn State's cumulative conference winning percentage from all their Big Ten opponents. And right now that looks good for the Nittany Lions. The other scenario is that Indiana loses both of its games and Michigan also, or Ohio State also loses to Michigan. In that case, you would be the pick as well. So at the end of the day, you're relying on a 5-5 Michigan team that has not been impressive to beat this Ohio State squad in Columbus next Saturday, or you're hanging your hat on a Purdue team that we just saw last Saturday. They're not good. They haven't beaten an FBS opponent this year. They somehow end the magic for Indiana next week. So it doesn't look all that promising, but the playoffs are right there. And Mark, of course, we're at the stage of the year where every trip to the practice field is going to bring us, a kind of a new indication of where they are from a health standpoint. We're going to get into some of those injury updates in a second. But I thought a defining theme of this week 11 of the season was everybody has 2 feet solidly on the Tyler Warren hype train. If they didn't already, it's happening now. Heisman Trophy is being discussed pretty openly now in our media conversations. Will it pan out that way that he gets to Manhattan for the ceremony? It's probably still a long shot, but this is really interesting how we've had this late season generation of Tyler Warren being that dude.
Yeah, I mean, but I can't help thinking, where this might have been had he gotten the ball against Ohio State when it mattered, right? And, ultimately, I think that's going to be what ends up hurting him. Nothing that
Heisman moment. It may have been a Heisman moment.
That's what I'm talking about. And even if it wasn't, at least you would have given him the opportunity. I mean, they have to be kicking themselves. They do. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And it's unfortunate because it was one moment in a season where they've handled this guy as well as you could possibly handle a tight end. I mean, Kotelnicki has gotten things out of this guy that, listen, we knew for the last couple of years how good he could be. He was just slowed a little bit by being some bumps and bruises, and that he was playing alongside of some very good players. I didn't know he could be this good. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to vote for the Heisman, and it's one of the difficult things is you're not seeing every single player every down. And I think for a guy like Tyler Warren, you have to see him playing every down, play in and play out. And it's not just the receiving, it's not just the rushing, it's the blocking. It's the little things he does. It's the leadership. It's all of that stuff. So listen, we're not allowed to share who we're voting for, and it would be premature to start thinking about casting votes now with, everything that still is ahead. But he has to be in the mix for anybody who's seeing him. I mean, he just absolutely has to be. And for me, Penn State has had some great tight ends. I have covered a lot of great tight ends. I don't know that anybody's better than this guy. I know that Kyle Brady wasn't given these opportunities, and why would you be when you're surrounded by Kajana Carter and Bobby Ingram and all these different players? But this guy is as complete a tight end at Penn State as I've ever seen. Let me put it that way. And, Kyle Brady was up there. He did some things as a blocker in that Illinois game back in '94 against Simeon Rice and that crew that was absolutely unbelievable. Dana Howard, I think, was the other guy. But this guy, I mean, the stuff that Kotelnicki has gotten out of him has been just unbelievable. And I think you're going to see it continue. I mean, I think they're going to continue to try to get him the ball because if he is going to make a push, I mean, he's going to have to keep piling up the big stats.
More on that with my bold prediction later. We did hear from tight ends coach Ty Howell on Thursday morning, and he had some really good commentary. I think about 80% of the questions were geared toward Tyler Warren, which is what you'd anticipate coming off a game like that and during a season like this. And Daniel, I thought he brought up a really good point in saying the differentiating factor between Tyler Warren and a lot of players across college football, if you're trying to find truly the best football player possible, is the fact that on one play, he'll go from sealing the edge against a 9 technique who's 280 pounds, 6'6", and then the next play, he'll take a snap and use his speed to go 50 yards down the sideline for a touchdown. He challenged us to find other players who are going to get that done.
Yeah, I think that this total body of work for Tyler Warren is super, super impressive. I mean, like Mark said, watching him down to down, everything they ask him to do, everywhere he's lining up on the field and what he's doing when he's lined up there is really, really impressive. I'm really curious how these next couple of weeks shake out in terms of not just the Heisman, but when you think about the Mackey, you think about the Horning. I think he's also a semifinalist for Walter Camp Player of the Year. Warren is someone who is out there, and is going to be, a name that people are going to have to consider when they're voting for these All-America teams and everything else. I am curious when it comes to feeding him the ball, getting him some numbers. I think they can get him to some round numbers that could make an impact on some people's perception, I think, especially when you look at what Harold Fannin has done at Bowling Green and in getting over 1,000 yards. But, it's, Mark talks about the Ohio State being a potential Heisman moment for him, being an area where they really dropped the ball. I think that personally, if you go back after that USC game, I think that that's when they should have really launched the campaign for him to be Heisman. I think that to be in that consideration, I think that double pass play where he snaps the ball and catches the touchdown pass. I mean, I think that obviously a Heisman moment would have been taking down the number 2 or number 4 team in the nation, keeping your team undefeated. But I think like a Heisman play, that is something that qualifies as it. And I really think that after that, that's when things should have really kicked into overdrive with everything. But we'll see. I mean, it's, that when you have these numbers and it's something that's so subjective, like football, it makes it really entertaining. Like Bowling Green sent out their most recent Harold Fannin email for your consideration email on Monday. And at the bottom of it, a new edition this week, because the big knock on him is that he doesn't block, So at the bottom of it, they have the PFF run grades for all of the 8 Mackey semifinalists. Guess who's number 1? Harold Fannin. Guess who's number 7? Tyler Warren. I think that you can look at these like so many different ways. And I think the one thing that I think that people shouldn't lose sight of is that a lot of these guys are just really awesome players. Like watching Harold Fannin against Penn State was awesome. Seeing what he's done against other teams has been awesome. Seeing what Tyler Warren has done this whole year has also been awesome. But we'll see once these ballots get counted, once these awards come out. I know in my calendar, I've got all the dates down for, what's going to get announced when, and we'll be ready. And I think we'll all be really glued to it.
And you know what else was awesome? Watching everything that Saquon Barkley did in 2017. He didn't go to New York City that year. He became the number 2 pick in the NFL draft. He was a beast as a receiver, as a kick returner, as a rusher. He was one of the most exciting players any Penn State fan has seen, but he didn't get to Manhattan for that award ceremony. So it's a tough place to get to on any given year. And regardless of that, it doesn't shortchange Tyler Warren's accomplishments, but we got a few weeks to figure that out. You've got 2 more regular season weekends. You've got the conference championship round to come in the first start of December, and then you've got the Heisman Trophy ceremony. So we'll table the conversation for now. I want to get over to some availability notes coming off the practice field Wednesday evening, and we'll start at the perimeter. Mark, no Julian Fleming on the practice field during our 15-minute observation window that we get each week on Wednesdays. There was also no Elliott Washington with the cornerback group. And Washington left quite early during the first half at Purdue, ultimately did not return to game action. He's played, I think, 25-plus snaps in the preceding 8 matchups. And then Julian Fleming hasn't posted a bunch of production this year, but he's been out there consistently as the number 3 receiver if you look at the snap counts on a game-to-game and really overall collective basis. So which one of those absences concerns you more a few days shy kickoff?
Which position has less depth?
Yeah,
I think it's wide receiver without a question. And Daniel, I don't know what if does Pro Football Focus grade the blocking of wide receivers as well, because I have to imagine that Julian Fleming that's why he's out there, because he's comfortable doing that, which isn't an easy thing for young receivers to come in and do. I mean, let's face it, that is. I don't think Tysier Denmark is getting out there if he does get out there again because of his blocking ability. So if they don't have Julian Fleming, yeah, I mean, and listen, even though he doesn't have great numbers, he made a couple of real clutch plays in a big game for them, like at USC. So you know that he can do it if he absolutely has to. So between the two of them, not a knock on Elliott Washington, but I think the talent that they have at corner, even beyond the starters, I think that helps mitigate that loss if he's unable to go, which we don't know. We're just going based on what we saw at practice. But to me, yeah, Fleming, there's no doubt, just because he's played so much and he does a good job in the, blocking, and he'll make a play for you if you need it.
Mari Evans has 1 catch for 2 yards in the last 5 or 6 games. It was a 2-yard catch last Saturday. And so you're not really counting on the production there. And beyond that top 4 group, which also includes Harrison Wallace and Liam Clifford, the guys who've been out there a bunch, I mean, where's your confidence in the rest of that group? Anthony Ivey had a terrible drop last Saturday. Tyler Johnson doesn't have a target on the season, although he's played the 5th most snaps. We got to see one red zone one-on-one play last night of practice, and Tyler Johnson dropped the pass in the back of the end zone from Drew Aller that was placed right where it needed to be. That was our one look as a media group at the receivers in action. And then Tyser Denmark, I guess, is a bit more of a wild card. He had a 16-yard punt return last week, but he also had a ball that I think struck him in the face mask from Bober Beulah, and he missed out on that. So we'll find out, and we'll be keeping tabs. These two will be in particular during
one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this would be a great opportunity to see more of Dinkins and Reynolds, right? Not that we haven't seen a lot of them, but get them more involved in the passing game, because if he's unable to go, listen, that those 2 guys can do it. I mean, Dinkins has made big plays in games, and Reynolds, if you throw him the ball, he's going to catch it and do something with it. They just haven't. And I'm not being critical. When you have Tyler Warren, you don't necessarily have to do that. But listen, the lack of production you're getting from the receiving core, it may be time to start, focusing more on these non-Tyler Warren tight ends and see what they can do for you in the passing game, especially if they start bracketing Tyler Warren or figuring out ways to kind of take him out of the game, because I just don't know. I mean, you look around, and I think, Trey Wallace, we have a feel for what he can do. Liam Clifford has flashed, but beyond that, you mentioned it, Amari Evans, I think that's been one of the stunners for everybody, right? I mean, I think we all expected more out of him this season.
He made his first start since the UCLA matchup in early October on the road at Purdue. Again, a 2-yard catch early, but that's his only reception in the last 4 games. And I will note on Harrison Wallace, he has produced 6 20-yard grabs in the last 5 contests. So I think that you're getting something from him, a vertical presence from him that's been fairly consistent. But overall, that average depth per target we talked about, it has gone down and down and down during conference play. And I think part of that is Amari Evans' disappearing act from the passing attack. And obviously they've been able to really rely on some of that short to intermediate game with the running backs and the tight ends. But I want to look at in the trenches now, Daniel, with you, because our view of practice also provided some updates there. JB Nelson exited early at Purdue. He's a guy who's played at least 20 snaps in 6 different games. He was an 8-game starter last year at guard. He was involved at practice. He was in uniform on Wednesday. When we were watching some one-on-one work in the trenches with defensive linemen, didn't appear that he was going to be operating in that. We didn't see him there, but you saw him participating in some drills earlier. We also saw Jalen Harvey at defensive end. The freshman got in his 2nd game last Saturday, had a tackle for loss, flashed a little bit, but during a rush toward the pocket, we also saw him appear to hyperextend his left knee. It looked pretty ugly in real time. He had a lot of help getting off the field, but there he was, full go on the practice field. That's a really good sign. And then, as has been the case the last couple of weeks, Daniel, Denai Dennis Sutton, we're going to categorize him as limited. Wasn't involved in every single drill. There was a span that I saw where he was actually not wearing a helmet, and he was working on some hand work to the side with a scout team offensive lineman. So 3 names to work through there, 3 updates to work through there. What stands out to you?
Yeah, I'll start with Denai Dennis Sutton, and I think it goes back to what James Franklin said before the Ohio State game, where Denai is a veteran. He knows what he needs to do. He's played a lot of football for them. They kind of know what they have in him. So it's a question of, all right, get to Saturday, then we'll cut you loose, or you'll do as much as you can. Especially given how much he played last week and how effective he was. I kind of just viewed that as rest, limited, get him to Saturday, manage whatever he's been playing through since Wisconsin. Jalen Harvey, that one was a bit of a surprise. I think after James Franklin's presser on Saturday at Purdue, he mentioned Harvey offhand, and we were all kind of like, oh, that's nice that he's giving him a little shout out for getting in there. Maybe we'll see him again next year. And then he got another unprompted shout out on Monday, and so to see him out there, I thought that's a good sign for his health personally, and I think that as we look at this defensive end group towards this potential stretch run, however many games there are left, 3, 4, 5, whatever, the more pass rush depth you have, the better. And I think that with what he flashed when he was out there at Purdue, really, really good sign. So I know that he is good to go in terms of how much he can play while retaining his redshirt status. So we'll see if there's a situation where we can see him on Saturday at Minnesota. And JB Nelson, it was good to see him out there. I know that he was hanging around the sideline. He was on the field still after the game at Purdue. So whatever happened to him wasn't bad enough that he needed to leave and go to the locker room for treatment right away or whatever. So I think that that's a sign that points in the right direction. But at the same time, you look at the depth that Penn State has on the interior. They haven't been taking Venga Ioane off of the field. And so when JB Nelson has played, Venga's played right guard, and you've taken Saul Wormley off. So I think that you're good, I think, with depth there, because Cooper Cousins is also in the mix as someone who can play. So we'll see with JB. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see him out there on Saturday, but if they're in a position where they feel like they need to rest him or something along those lines, or he's not quite there, then they've got other guys.
Daniel and Mark will be in Minneapolis for team arrival. They'll be watching closely as the warm-ups occur on the field. So we'll get a better perspective leading toward kickoff over at Lions247.com from these guys on what they're witnessing, what they're hearing, and ultimately what that availability report looks like that Penn State's going to have to put out in pregame. Mark, I thought another theme of this week, before we dive into some key matchup storylines, was Tom Allen getting some praise from James Franklin, maybe James Franklin going out of his way a little bit to make sure that we were hearing it, that the fans were hearing it. And he made an interesting point when it was followed up upon on Wednesday evening, because he brought it up Monday during his press conference about how Tom Allen and this defense are probably being overlooked a little bit, not getting discussed enough in the grand scheme of Penn State's 2024 success. And he brought up the point on Wednesday that sometimes it's all about who you follow to your job. And he said, when you follow Manny Diaz and what that guy did here in Happy Valley, especially last year, unless you're the number one defense in the country, it's hard to go up anywhere. And so he thinks that's part of it. What did you make of his commentary, Mark, on Tom Allen and overall the body of work that the former Indiana head coach has put together here in year one?
Yeah. Is there anybody on this team that we're talking enough about? Seriously, is there anybody in the Penn State program that we're talking? How many times?
I think James Franklin thinks we're talking about him enough. But other than him, maybe not anybody.
Well, I'm glad he told us why Tom Allen wasn't getting enough credit, unlike
but it's like,
some other people.
It's every single time you ask about somebody, it's like we're not talking enough about him. I mean, does James listen to every single thing that's actually out there? But in all seriousness, this could have gone a very different way after that Ohio State game. I mean, the defense had been playing well all year, or for most of the year. I mean, there were obviously some spots against, Bowling Green where things didn't go so well and against USC. But, you get in a spot where you have a team at its 1 yard line and you need a defensive stop, and they come out and run it 11 straight times, 10 times, I think, and then taking a knee to run out the clock. That could rip the heart out of a defense. And to his credit, and to the players' credit, and to the defensive assistants' credit, that did not happen. And I think that has to go. If you're going to blame the coordinator when things go wrong, I think you have to give him credit for them not losing their aggressiveness, for not losing that swagger that they had shown up until that point. I mean, overall in that Ohio State game, I remember I gave them a D, and then I went back and some people got on me for giving the defense a D, and they were right. I should have given them a better grade. But overall, I mean, what more could you ask for? They're playing extremely well. There are times when they can give up some yardage, but typically it's bend but don't break. We're seeing what he's been able to do with Abdul Carter. I remember in the preseason talking and thinking, what is this guy who immerses himself in film? And what is he ultimately going to be able to do once Abdul Carter gets comfortable? And we're seeing it, aren't we? And then you bring Denai Dennis Sutton back, and you have him opposite Abdul. And I just think all the things he's doing, but we can talk about X's and O's all you want. I think not losing this defense after that brutal drive that it gave up, that, when they still had every opportunity to win that game, 3 timeouts, we've been through. We don't have to rehash it further, I guess. But I think him not losing it is you get a sense for kind of the measured professional that Tom Allen is.
Well, Mark, this primary defense has not given up a touchdown since that Ohio State game. We saw them give up a late touchdown at Purdue when they had some of the third teamers in and the freshmen on the field. And James Franklin wasn't thrilled about this, but you're absolutely right. The response has been impressive. Maybe a little bit of a step up this week on the road at Minnesota, but they've answered the call thus far and trying to get Penn State to the playoff off that loss. Let's dive into the matchup here. We discussed a bunch from a Minnesota angle. As I said last episode, we've obviously been breaking down where Penn State is coming into this matchup over the course of the week, but specifically looking at Saturday afternoon and as kickoff approaches, Daniel, I was in the stadium alongside Mark back in 2019. I believe it was a noon kickoff back then, but you walked in and you could feel it was an upset-minded environment. They were unbeaten. Minnesota was a better team back then, but they had that upset on their minds. And that's what it's been for the last 2 weeks with a bye week to kind of deal with. It feels like, man, if Penn State can go 4 straight weeks with a fast start, they're going to be in really good shape at Minneapolis. And conversely, if they come out the gates stumbling in a way we haven't seen lately, it could spell a really, really painstaking afternoon for Nittany Lions fans to kind of deal with and have to grit and see if they can pull it out. Daniel, what do you think about the importance of those first, let's say, 15 minutes of football? Because you've got Penn State going up 10-0 against Ohio State, I believe it was. Go up 28-0 against Washington. They're up 21-3 at halftime. They get 14 points on the board at Purdue off their first 2 possessions. They've got a really good thing going right now.
Yeah, that 2019 game that you brought up, I was in New York City that day watching that game at an Alabama bar because that was the day of that Alabama LSU game. That was an epic, and that was a real cultural experience to get to watch that game in an Alabama bar. Shout out to Mark Torrance. But no, I think that you look at Minnesota, and they're a team that if you don't get a fast start, that they can drag you down into the muck a little bit. They are a team that against inferior opponents, like the Maryland Terrapins, they can blitz them. They can really put it on you with some of the skill talent that they have. But you look at how they've won some of their other games, like against Illinois and against Rutgers, and they've got a lot of 20-something to 17-something type
Daniel,
score.
Careful, Daniel. They didn't beat Rutgers.
Oh, shoot, I'm blanking. Wow. I was blanking on the Illinois game, but no,
they beat UCLA by 4 points. I mean, they've had to come back in some of these Big Ten games. They've definitely been battling, and just by the way, they held a late lead at Rutgers. They ended up losing that game a couple weeks ago before their bye week, 26-19. So that dropped them to 6-4. They were to the point where they could have won 5 straight coming into this matchup and been 7-2, and so instead they're 6-4 with that loss.
Yeah, so I think that some of these games that they play that get a little ugly, that get a little station to station, are in that range of that Rutgers game. 20-something to a teen-something, how they beat UCLA in that one game. I think that's, if Minnesota can dictate things a little bit against a team that is either equal to them or potentially a little better, I think that's how the game script can go a little bit. But I think that if you are Penn State, you can get out to that fast start, put them in a little bit of a hole. And then we've seen what this defense has done these past 2 weeks when you've given it that cushion, when you can let them play loose, play free. You can let Abdul Carter basically do whatever he wants to the opposing offensive line. I think that is where you see Penn State really at its most effective. So, I think that, these fast starts are going to be important. We know that James Franklin likes to defer the opening coin toss and take the ball to start the second half. But if you're at a situation like you were at Purdue last week where they give you the ball first, why not take it, go down the score, put 7 up? You're dictating the terms of the game. And I think that Penn State, being the more talented team, if they're dictating things, they're in a really good spot.
Talking about dictating terms, Mark, this is a Minnesota ground game that has really struggled to do that. And this feels like a very hard opportunity for them to find it all of a sudden in game number 11 against this particular Penn State defense. Just looking through some recent history, Penn State since 2022 has held more opponents under 100 rushing yards than anyone in the FBS. 18 of the last 21 Big Ten opponents they have faced have been held under 100 rushing yards, and this Minnesota team ranks 17th out of 18 in the conference. We'll get to their quarterback in a moment, but Mark, to me, if it's clear early and often that Minnesota can't run the ball, they can't put themselves in second and third manageable situations, and they've got to rely completely on Brosmer at quarterback, that is the recipe you want for Penn State. Because I know he hasn't turned the ball over, Brosmer, yet, but this Minnesota team, when they've been at their best and when they've given Penn State fits, it's because they've had balance. And in fact, in the past, they've been able to lean on that ground game. They have not been able to do that this year. And again, it just feels like a hard time for them to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Big Ten stats here. They had 35 rushing yards against Rutgers, which is fourth from the bottom in the Big Ten in rushing defense. The one thing when you look at this Minnesota offense and how bad the numbers are overall, you also have to factor into you take into account that Minnesota has not played Oregon, has not played Ohio State, has not played Indiana, has not played Penn State. What do those teams have in common? They're the four best defensive teams in the Big Ten. People may not think that about Indiana, but Indiana's playing really good defense. So these numbers are that bad playing against a lousy schedule. I mean, I will be stunned if they are able to run the ball against Penn State. Again, I mean, 35 yards against Rutgers. And to get to the next topic, the segue is, if you can't run the ball against Penn State, what's going to happen? They're going to unleash Abdul Carter and their pass rushers, and that's going to make life very difficult for the quarterback. So, yeah, I don't see that changing. And that's why I go back to what I said at the start of the show. Penn State really offensively has to play with that mindset that, listen, it'd be great if you score 50 points, but do not risk turnovers to do that, because if you get to 25, 30 points, you're going to be in great shape to win this game.
Minnesota running back Darius Taylor has 3 100-yard games on the season against Illinois, against USC, against Nevada. 10 carries, 28 yards against Rutgers. We were told he was banged up and going into that matchup, dealing with that. The bye week, there's some hope in Minneapolis that Taylor can be a little bit more fresh, but this has been really laid more at the feet of the offensive line than it has been at the running back room in terms of their issues on the ground. And so getting over to Brosmer, Daniel, this guy is a former FCS All-American at New Hampshire. He was one of the more interesting commodities available in the transfer portal last offseason, and he's been a really impressive pickup for Minnesota. I know Ryan Burns think that he is playing quarterback as well as anybody in a Golden Gophers uniform since that 2019 version of Tanner Morgan, who tore apart Penn State 5 years ago. And you look at the way he's done it, it's been some comebacks involved, high completion percentage, and as James Franklin pointed out early in the week, protecting the football. No turnovers from this quarterback since September. What's the recipe against this for Penn State's defense?
I think that it's one of those games where you're going to need these individual players to step up, and when they have opportunities in front of them, take advantage of it. James Franklin has brought it up before when it comes to the secondary and the pass defense of wanting to have more guys get their hands on the football. Jalen Reed is the only one who's really done it on a consistent basis. AJ Harris had his interception against Illinois. Zion Tracy had his pick 6 against Ohio State. But largely, there haven't been a whole lot of turnovers forced by this defense this year. And I think that going back to that Tom Allen conversation, I think that's also part of the reason why Allen might be a little bit more under the radar, might not be getting as much credit, because those Manny Diaz defenses, you forced a lot of turnovers. You were really active, lots of blitzing, everything that goes along with it. So even when you're just watching it, there's the sense that almost like more is happening and there's more going on. And turnovers were a big part of that. But I think this is the type of game where if you're Abdul Carter or Denai Dennis Sutton, if you get to Max Brosmer, you get the strip sack. If you're on the back end, if one of those guys gets a pressure, forces an errant throw, that you're there to pick it off. I think that we've seen these guys look pretty prepared. Like a couple of the interceptions this year, like Zion Tracy's, Jalen Reed's, and against Wisconsin, and AJ Harris's, they all said that on those picks, the quarterback did exactly what they thought they were going to do. And so I think that if you're Penn State, you just have to be on your P's and Q's. And when you have that chance, you really got to take advantage of it, because Brosmer is not going to give you that many.
Last time Penn State went to Minneapolis, the margin for turnovers got away from the Nittany Lions, and it cost them in a big way. This is a Minnesota team that they've built themselves to 6-4 based on a lot of that. They are number 1 in the Big Ten with 20 takeaways. They are number 2 in the country with 16 interceptions defensively, and as we said, their quarterbacks protecting the football. So when it comes to Penn State's quarterback, Mark, Drew Aller, a guy who we know doesn't have a penchant for putting the ball in precarious spots. 3 of his interceptions, 5 on the season, came against USC, including that Hail Mary at the end of regulation. What do you view as the blueprint for a successful afternoon, early evening in Minneapolis for Penn State with Drew Aller, and then also their ground game? And when I talk about their ground game, I'm talking traditional ground game. Not Tyler Warren, not Bo Prabula, but those 2 running backs that we've seen this team lean on heavily in years past, but not so much of late.
Yeah, with Aller, I mean, last week against Purdue, he was 17 of 19, and one of those passes was a drop by Katron Allen. Only 2 of his passes traveled more than 15 yards in the air. Obviously, one was the bomb to Harrison Wallace. So I think he just has to keep doing what he's doing and not try to do too much, because he doesn't have to. With respect to the traditional running game, I mean, it's weird. You look at the Big Ten stats, and I was stunned when I saw this, but Penn State is 2nd in the Big Ten in rushing offense. Only the only team other than Iowa to be averaging at least 200 yards. So does it matter if it's Katron Allen and Singleton when you're getting what you're getting out of Tyler Warren, or when Bo Prabula can give you things, and when Drew Aller has been sneaky good? I mean, if you look at, I don't have the number in front of me, Daniel, you may remember it, but I'm not sure how many rushes Drew Aller has had, but a high percentage of those have been for first downs. So when he's going, he's making very smart decisions. So I don't know that you necessarily, we're this far into the season, are we going to see anything different? We're still wondering if Nick Singleton is full go. I mean, he sure seems like he's been limited, and then that was kind of, hit on again a couple games ago, and then he comes back, and he just hasn't been kind of the workhorse. So I don't know that you need it. You're averaging 200 yards per game. Keep doing what you're doing, and maybe that's part of why they've been so successful, is because you go back to last year, under the previous coordinator, you pretty much knew when they were going to run the ball every time, and you knew who was going to get it. And now that's kind of been turned on its head. So I think just getting rushing production is the key. I don't care who it comes from.
Nick Singleton doesn't have 50 rushing yards in a game since September. Katron Allen under 4 yards per carry in 4 of the last 6 games here, or 4 of the last 6 games, I think. So it's interesting that they have been as productive as you described on the ground collectively, and yet it hasn't been these 2 players necessarily at the spearhead of that on a week-to-week basis. One more thing before we talk about our players to watch and predictions. Freshmen are full go, a lot of them at least, because they can play without any thoughts for the red shirt. We saw that occur last week. None of us are predicting, spoiler alert, a 28-plus point win for Penn State. But considering who's been out there, considering where Penn State may need some help, any particularly intriguing freshman who hasn't burned their red shirt yet for you this Saturday, Daniel?
I mean, I think Max Granville is the name that has been floating out there for a while in terms of when he got to campus, the feedback we've gotten of him. And he's been kind of the name that's popped up the most about the guy who has walked right up to the green light line and has, maybe at one point had a toe over it with Denai Dennis Sutton being hurt and whatnot. And so I think that Granville is someone that I would be, really interested to see in the run of play. At this point, he's played in 2 games, so he is good to go for the next 2. And so I think that he is someone that I'm just really interested in seeing, because we haven't really had the chance to see him do much one-on-one work, anything like that. And I think that given what we've heard in some of the comparisons, he could be a really fun player.
Anyone for you, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, after the way the backup linebackers struggled on that 3rd series against Purdue, I mean, we went over this earlier in the week. I mean, it was the one time in the first half when Purdue really moved the ball. And I actually liked the fact that the coaching staff got the young guys in there to see what they were up to. But I wonder if we don't start to see more of Anthony Specca from here on out. I mean, just with all due respect to the backups, they haven't gotten it done when they've been out there. And why not give a true freshman the opportunity if you find yourself in that position? I'm not saying it necessarily has to be a blowout, but if you have some sort of lead in the first half and you have the luxury of trying to get a young linebacker in there, I would like to see more of Specca just to see what he's all about. In defense of Tamir Robinson, I think he did better toward the end of the game, but Specca to me is a guy that I'd like to see more of.
Robinson saw career-high snaps last Saturday. Specca has now played 3 games, so they have a decision to make there. They can get him in one of the next 2 unless you want to burn his red shirt here. I don't think that's what they want to do by playing him in the last 3 games. I'll just quickly go back to Tyseer Denmark because of what we haven't seen production-wise from some of the receivers, and you throw in the fact that Julian Fleming was missing, and we still don't think Caden Saunders is going to be back up to speed that he needs to be to get involved. So I'll go Tyseer Denmark because he's that one freshman in the group that at receiver where you may need some help from the depth perspective at Minneapolis. Let's dive into our players to watch now, Mark, and tell us anybody except Anthony Specca, I guess.
Oh, man. I was going to go with Tyseer Denmark. Now, I think the turnover king shows up it on a stage where you're playing against the best team in turnover margin in the Big Ten. I think the turnover king, Zakee Wheatley, if I can spit it out, is going to have at least 1 turnover. He's been playing well all year, second on the team in tackles and 55, but he has a nose for the football, as well as the QB has been playing for Minnesota. I think the pressure that Penn State's going to be able to get on is going to cause them to make a couple of tough decisions, and I look for the takeaway king to get at least 1 pick. That's not my bold prediction. That's just my player to watch.
It's pretty bold, though, when you got an interception off a quarterback who hasn't been throwing them in a couple months. So, Daniel, what do you have for us for player to watch?
Yeah, that's Mark's bold prediction. I'm interested to see how bold he'll get.
Oh, you have no idea.
It's time. I'm going with Luke Reynolds here. I know that, Tyler, you asked James Franklin about a potentially expanded role on Monday, and
James a lot of cold water on that one, didn't he?
Yeah, James was asking if you were advocating for less Tyler Warren in the offense, but I do think that they've thrown him the ball a couple times now. We saw what he could do as a receiver in game. You have that on film now. He hadn't had a catch in, I think, more than a month before Saturday against Purdue. And I think that if there is, something up with Julian Fleming in that he can't go or is limited, I think you could see a lot of 2 tight end sets, even 3 tight end sets with Warren, Dinkins, and Reynolds out there. And I think this is an opportunity for him. I'm expecting a physical game. Given you're playing a Big Ten West team, you sort of know how these games kind of go sometimes. And I think that your tight ends can come up big. So I think Reynolds will be someone interesting to watch over the course of Saturday.
I just think maybe there's a way to keep him involved where he's not just doing the dirty work for 15 snaps a game. He just seems to bring too much of a ceiling to the field for you. Maybe you can tap into that these next few games. I'm going to go back to Nick Singleton here. You got to go back to September, that really impressive performance against Illinois, the last time he handled more than a dozen carries in a matchup. You've got to go back to the Wisconsin matchup in late October, the last time he handled a double-digit carry total. He went 6 carries against Ohio State, 7 carries against Washington, 7 carries against Purdue. Now, the last couple of weeks, different circumstances involved there, the lingering injury issue, or was it a new injury issue against Washington? Maybe we'll never know. Last week, you got a big lead built against Purdue, get him to the sideline. But the thing that I want to note here is in the last 2 weeks, he averaged 6.4 yards per carry against Washington. He averaged 5.7 yards per carry against Purdue. It was a relatively small sample size, but those are his best per rush averages since September. So I'm wondering, and we saw him return a kickoff that was called back along the way. So I'm wondering, has Nick Singleton gotten himself to a point where there is more to kind of take out of that rushing attack than he had been able to provide for a couple weeks? I think this might be a good opportunity for us to see that. And in my opinion, if Nick Singleton is kind of kept to a very minimum approach as a rusher, I think that's a good indication of just where he is right now and what he may not be able to give Penn State. But to me, if he can flash a little bit more as a runner, we know what he's done as a receiver, but if he can present that kind of threat, a guy who can pick up first downs at any moment, maybe race for a touchdown at any moment like he did early in the season, it just really changes the dynamic of, I think, how we can all view Penn State's offense approaching the postseason, because right now that just hasn't been the same element from Nick Singleton during the second half of the year. Injury playing a role in that and whatever. But so I'm going to go Nick Singleton in the spotlight in Minneapolis. And let's get to our predictions of the bold and score variety. And we'll begin here with you, Daniel.
I'll start with my bold prediction. We've seen Zion Tracy look a lot more comfortable and confident in that punt returner role over the past couple of weeks, and I think he's going to break one. I think we're going to get a Zion Tracy punt return touchdown here. Golden Gophers haven't allowed a punt return touchdown this season, but they do rank number 95 nationally, allowing 9.46 yards per return. Tracy had a nice little 13-yarder last week against Purdue. I just think that the way that he's kind of moving, you can see him with the potential to break one. And I think that the way that Minnesota plays, I think that this should be a kind of a shorter game, maybe a little bit more low-scoring game. So you get that extra touchdown in special teams. That bumps Penn State up over 30 points for a 31-13 win. Like I said earlier, we know how these games tend to go sometimes against a team like Minnesota. And I do think that if Penn State can't jump out early, they'll be in the muck a little bit. But I think that Penn State right now, they're just playing too well. They're too talented. They have too much at stake to really falter here. I think they're in a really good position to take care of business. They've won on the road already this year, undefeated away from Beaver Stadium. So I think that they take care of business here and move to 10-1.
Well, Minnesota insider Ryan Burns told us on Wednesday's episode that it's been one thing or the other every week for Minnesota special teams in terms of things being problematic. So maybe you called your shot right there. Mark, what do you got for us?
So much has been made of Minnesota's turnover margin and the fact that the QB hasn't been picked off. Well, you want to know why? Look at the schedule. You look at the Big Ten leaders in yards per game, limiting yards per game. Minnesota has played one of those teams, Iowa, and scored 14 points against them. So this is a completely different animal that they're going to be seeing defensively than they've seen all year. I mean, as good as Iowa is, it's not in Penn State's league. So I think the Penn State defense is going to take care of business. I think the offense is going to play intelligent football, and I'm looking at a relatively easy 31-10 win. That number 31 seems to be common. My bold prediction, going back to turnovers, I do think we're making a little bit too much of that with respect to how few Minnesota has had. Abdul Carter, the one thing that's missing from his Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year resume is turnovers. I mean, he's been unbelievable with 17.5 tackles for loss, leading the conference by a wide margin. Is that second in the nation, Tyler? I know that you're on top of this stuff. I think anybody who has watched him realizes he probably should have 4, 5, 6 more sacks than he has, if not for being held. But he has yet to have a turnover, whether it's a fumble or whether it's an interception, dropping back into coverage, which he does well. I think you're going to see Abdul Carter pad that resume a little bit with a turnover.
31 is a popular number. That's where I've got Penn State scoring, and I've got Minnesota scoring 17. So like these two, I've got Penn State covering that 11.5-point spread on the road. I think that ultimately the big difference in this game is going to be on the ground. You're going to see Penn State achieve offensive balance, create opportunities for Drew Aller to exploit downfield, and conversely, Minnesota is going to struggle to put itself in manageable second and third down distance situations because of that ground attack. You're going to have the pass rush start to get elevated, and we know what that looks like. I mean, we've got a few seasons of sample size now, what that looks like when Penn State can put that blueprint to action. I think that's what you'll see take place, and ultimately that will get into the pocket, impacting Brosmer. They will get a turnover or two in this matchup. They'll end that streak. But I think they'll also be able to grind this one out on the ground if they need to toward the end. If it's a clock milking situation, if it's putting together one of those, dagger kind of drives to put the game out of reach with 14 plays, 70 yards, it takes 6 minutes. I think they're going to have that kind of ability to move the ball with effectiveness over the course of the afternoon. And then my bold prediction, I said I'd go back to Tyler Warren here. I think he's going to account for a career best 3 total touchdowns in Minneapolis. And then Penn State's going to spend the next week promoting a late rising Heisman Trophy campaign to everybody that will listen and even people who won't listen. And I think ultimately I want to make point accounts for 3 touchdowns. Didn't say he scores them himself. I'm bringing in the possibility of Warren maybe throwing for running for and catching a touchdown in the same matchup. And wouldn't that be a nice little bullet point to add to the Heisman Trophy resume if you're Penn State and the star tight end? So we've all got Penn State prevailing. Daniel and Mark will be hitting the road, hitting the skies on Friday to get up there, and they will bring
one more thing, Tyler.
Yeah, bring it to us.
I wanted to take a second to thank everybody who says hello to us when we're out in the wild and how much they appreciate the site and appreciate the podcast. When we're traveling around in airports and stuff, it's pretty cool when people come over and say hello. Would also encourage everybody who sees the celebrity Tyler Donahue out in public to go over, talk some Penn State football. He enjoys it. But in all seriousness, I get a lot of positive feedback about what's going on the site. You two guys do a tremendous job. Tyler, Calvaruso, Doan. We're nothing without the community. But when people take a minute to say that, it means a lot to us, and we don't take that for granted. So thanks to everybody who listens to the podcast. I know when we get into the grind of doing these over and over and over again, sometimes, we forget, and that's mostly on me. But I really appreciate people who take the time to say hello and how much they appreciate the work we do. So thanks, everybody.
I'll co-sign that. I know Daniel will too. And I'll just note that we've done 11 of these weeks. We got 11 of these game weeks in the books now. We've brought you 3 episodes before each one of these matchups. Thank you to everyone for following us along. If you've picked us up along the way this season, welcome aboard. But we've got one more of these weeks, and then things are going to get really interesting in December because it's like breaking news, playoff game, breaking news. It's going to be insane.
Portal.
Portal, signing day. There's a ton happening in December around the corner, but we'll focus on the matchup for now. Minnesota, Penn State, Saturday afternoon, full coverage at Lions247.com. Post-game podcast with me and Daniel coming your way on Saturday evening. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. They're Daniel Gowan and Mark Brennan, and this has been the Lions247 Podcast.